Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi. I am a co-president of ColumbiaDC and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. I would like to thank our partners at the Yale Club of DC and their members for joining us in this gathering. We are very honored to have Professor Schleicher to talk about the fiscal solvency of the states and what Hamilton and the Constitution, for that matter, have to say about it. Please allow me to briefly introduce our great panel today. I would encourage everyone to check our website for the full bios and detailed list of their great accomplishments and work. David Schleicher is a professor of law at Yale Law School and is an expert in election law, land use, local government law, federalism, state and local finance, municipal, bankruptcy, and urban development. His work has been published widely in academic journals and cited in think tanks and media. Schleicher was previously an associate professor of law at George Mason University School of Law, where he won the university's Teaching Excellence Award. He also taught at Georgetown, Harvard, and New York University. He's a 2004 magna cum laude graduate of Harvard Law School, also holds an MSc in economics from London School of Economics, and also an AB in economics and government from Dartmouth College. And for our host this evening, we have Kate Benner, a ColumbiaDC board member, colleague, and a member of King & Spalding's environmental health and safety practice. Benner has experience defending companies in investigations and enforcement actions brought by the Department of Justice, state attorneys general, and various state government agencies. Benner holds an AB from Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University and also a JD from Columbia Law School. So with that, let's send it to Kate.
Hi, everyone. Can you see me?
We are waiting for your camera.
There we go.
Yes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's virtual town hall. We're really excited to welcome Professor Schleicher and to dig into the topic of state solvency from both a historical perspective and then a policy perspective as we look at it today. It's a great day to sort of dive into this topic. Today, Illinois' governor signed a budget, which in part will be relying on federal aid. So this is a really active question before state governments and also the federal government. So I'd like to start off by sort of setting the stage with Professor Schleicher. When we were in February 2020, let's say before the recession, which set in during that month, where were the states?
It's a great question. Hi, first of all, I want to say thanks to you all for having me. It's fun to be here, let's dive in. Before even we get into where the states were in February 2020, I want to talk a little bit about what states are like as fiscal entities. And so when people think about state and local finance, well, first off, they don't. They don't usually think about state and local finance, but when they do, they kind of usually imagine it as a mini version of what we talk about when we talk about the federal budget, where we have a debate about balanced budgets but never really mean it, or where there's a variety of moves that everyone's used to when they're talking about the federal budget, debt budget, and budget deficits. States are very different. States and cities are very different from the federal government when we talk about their budgets. States can't print money. It's the fundamental first thing about states and their finance, unlike the US government, which borrows in dollars and can print dollars, and therefore can always print money if it needs to, in theory, to pay its debts. States don't do that. They borrow in what's effectively a foreign currency. Further, unlike the federal government, which is the US government, which is the biggest, baddest borrower in the world, states have limits on how much people will lend them. They have credit ratings that are, bond ratings that are vary substantially across the states, but there's some limits on their ability to borrow. Further, because they can default and there are limits on their willingness to borrow, states have created a whole variety of legal tools. And we'll talk about this, I think, soon and kind of where these things come from, but legal limits on their budget. So they have what's called balanced budget rules that require them to keep a balanced budget in a current period. And there are ways to get around this, but it has some effect. Further, there are limits on debt issuance. And again, these vary by state, but there are limits. And as a result, state finance is what's called pro-cyclical. When the going is good, states have a lot more money and they can spend more money on programs and they can cut taxes or whatever it is they want to do with the money. But when things are bad, they have to cut. In theory, they could save in good times. And in fact, coming in February 2020, states had the biggest rainy day funds, which is what we call their savings, in history. But still, they don't save very much relative to the size of recessions or the size of budget holes created by recessions. As a result, when things are bad, they have to cut. And you saw, for instance, in 2008, the states cut for a long time after even the economy gets better. The length of the Great Recession was largely driven, or the length of it was driven by how many state and local cuts we saw. So in February 2020, states were on the heels of a 10-year economic expansion, and many were in quite good shape. Some, despite that long run, were in quite bad shape fiscally. They had not taken advantage of the 10 fat years, or you want to think of that, but whatever, the relatively long period of growth to get their fiscal house in order. And so when you think about the Illinois or the Connecticuts or the New Jerseys or the Chicagos or the Kentuckys of the world, they had largely they were in a very substantial amount of debt. For a whole variety of reasons, they'd largely put their debt in the form of underfunded pensions, and we can talk about that in a minute. But a good number of these jurisdictions were in not great fiscal shape, and there are reasons why this happened. But there was some substantial variance coming into the recession, to the COVID recession.
Okay, so now it's official. The board declared that we're in a recession. Where are the states?
In a whole world of hurt, I think is the short version. So the last jobs report noted that, which was broadly more positive than people thought, had one really dark note, which was that more than 500,000 state and local employees had lost their jobs. By the estimates created by the Board of Labor Statistics, the amount of firing that had happened, or job loss, had resulted in state and local governments employing fewer people than they had at any point since 2001. We're a much bigger country than 2001. So we've seen a huge amount of job loss. But for it's worth, this is something that people don't appreciate. Most people who work for the government in America work for state and local governments. More people work for local governments than work for the federal government. Or work state than work for the federal government. Most local employees, in fact, are local government employees, with a large majority of those being school district employees, teachers. The size of budget holes created by the COVID recession was particularly brutal in a couple of ways. And so there's still a lot to project about what's going forward, because we're projecting our budgets going forward. But there are a couple of reasons why this was particularly fiscally brutal on some jurisdictions, particularly brutal on everyone. The first is that states have become increasingly reliant on variable forms or highly volatile forms of taxes. So states traditionally did not rely very much on income taxes and capital, and they increasingly do, and increasingly on progressive income taxes. And this has the effect of making that when things get bad, their revenues fall by more. Further, one of the steadiest forms of state revenue is sales taxes, or traditionally it's been sales taxes. In this recession, one thing you may have noticed about yourself is that you're going out and buying less. You're engaged in fewer activities that are taxed at special rates, like restaurants or hotels, and you're doing more home production. Further, the healthiest part of the economy in work from home, which is professional services, is largely outside of sales taxes. And so this combined to make very large effects on state and local budgets. How large is still to be determined to some extent. By the way, also one of the things is that it's not just that they lost revenue, they had all sorts of new expenses. So they have new expenses of two sorts. One is direct COVID related stuff, like they had to buy PPE and they had to whatever, all the things people are doing to respond to the COVID pandemic, but also states are responsible for a huge amount of our social welfare spending. So we jointly run with the state, the federal government jointly runs with the states Medicaid. When times are bad, there's more demand for social welfare services, naturally. And one of the deep, to call it an irony is too soft, of the way we organize social welfare in America is that just when we need it the most is when we expect to see states and cities have to cut back on these things. And so you've seen this across a huge number of dimensions. So what we've seen is that states have had these giant budget holes, and cities too, or projected budget holes. How big, again, is very debated depending on what estimates you see. So Kroll just did an estimate that between states, cities, and authorities just on something in the 700 billion category. Democrats in Congress seem to think it's more like about $1 trillion. Others think it's a little less than that. Again, I'm not in the economic projection business. Some of you may be. There's a lot of variability in those. Clearly, if a vaccine comes sooner, or if everyone dies, you can imagine lots of different results that would change these projections really substantially. But the states are certainly in a world of hurt. In the early part of the response, we saw Congress giving some substantial amount of aid to states and cities. So Congress did a few things. They increased federal Medicaid spending. They passed the CARES Act, which included $150 billion in aid to states and cities with some restrictions that if you're interested we can talk about. And they gave a bunch of other money to transit agencies and schools and a few other things. So they also, as you mentioned, set up, with respect to Illinois, created a backstop for our Federal Reserve program called the Municipal Lending Facility that will provide emergency loans or short-term loans to states and cities.
Now, we've been talking about sort of states broadly. One of the issues politically early on was sort of red states versus blue states. Can you speak a little bit more about, is there a clear delineation with one sort of set of states being better off, or is this just a across the board terrible situation?
Well, so you can think about this in two ways, which is which places lost the most revenue and economic activity and which places came into the place with the most stress. Across the places that are hurt the most, the two categories of places, lots of places are hurt a lot, or every place is hurt a lot. The two types of places that have been hurt the most are oil producers and tourism hubs. So think Louisiana. Like Rhode Island, a few other places that are very heavily dependent on certain industries. In terms of places that came in, so again, that's not red state, blue state. There's because the COVID crisis has been more dramatic in coastal, mostly the Northeast, than it has been anywhere else. You might the relationship between how bad the crisis has been and how many people died and the fiscal effects is real, but pretty limited. New York is maybe an exception. New York's had some big problems. The other thing is like how bad were you coming into this? Again, here, red versus blue is not exactly the right metric, although states dominated by Democrat are probably a majority of the most stretched states. So you wanted to rank the states that came into the crisis in the worst shape, you'd say Illinois would be the worst. And then in the next category, it would be New Jersey, Connecticut, Kentucky, Louisiana. You could pick a few others if you wanted to, depending on how you want to think about it. And the last thing I'd say is that one thing that is particularly dramatic is that you saw in a number of Democratic states generally rely more, although not always, on progressive income taxes that are the most volatile form of taxes. So that is a pretty clear red-blue thing. So California is very heavily dependent on income taxes, so is New York. If income falls more dramatically in recessions, then that will be hit places more that have just kind of less taxing stuff going on, or that are more reliant on property taxes or something.
Okay, so we've sort of set the stage for where we are now. Let's look back to the Great Recession, which was the last time people were spending a lot of public attention on the sort of state of state budgets. What was the situation at that time?
Great. So notably, after the Great Recession started, a famous financial analyst named Meg Whitney declared that she thought there'd be 1,000 bankrupt states and cities. This was a bad projection. States did face a huge amount of fiscal stress, and you saw a bunch of places get in trouble of one sort or another. California, because of a budget impasse, ended up starting to issue IOUs to pay its debt, so not official debt, just like a piece of paper that said we're going to pay you at some point. A number of other states had pretty severe fiscal crises, but in 2008, the ARA, the Obama stimulus bill provided some substantial aid to states and cities that was helpful. They did a few other kind of clever things. If anyone's interested in talking about the Build America Bonds Act, I'm happy to talk about it, but they did some other things to help states out. And then what you saw over the course of the next number of years was kind of a non-crisis, but kind of slow crushing of state and local budgets, state and localities, raise taxes and cut spending, mostly cut spending, but raise taxes too. That kind of contributed to the slow recovery. It's like the exact opposite of what a Keynesian would suggest, but it didn't get into crisis form, with the exception of a few major jurisdictions. The most notable is Detroit, which filed for Chapter 9. So federal law provides a bankruptcy bankruptcy-like provision for cities. You saw that in a few cities. The biggest municipal bankruptcies of all time all come from this period. So you see a few of those, Detroit being the biggest, and then later on, it's well after it, you see the Puerto Rico bankruptcy, or whatever you want to call it. The Title III case. But the 2008 situation, where people thought there was going to be a crisis, the combination of federal aid and the fact that the economy started reviving allowed states and cities to survive, is the way I'd put it, but not thrive. And so you saw a kind of decreasing footprint of state and local governments in terms of, we ended up investing less in education and in roads. So the other way to think about this is that states and cities are responsible for a huge amount of our public investment in the future. So states and cities build most of our infrastructure. They do almost 100% of operations and maintenance, and they do a large percentage of capital expenditure. Further, they're the biggest funders of education, which you can also think of as an investment in, for the future, or the next generation and all that jazz. And you saw declining investment across all these categories. And there are a couple of reasons for that, one of which is the kind of long recession. The other major reason is, or the other two major reasons are the fact states had to spend more money on Medicaid as healthcare costs increased, and that they had refused, largely because of the recession, but also because of other things, their pension funds got very, very underfunded, which put increasing pressure on their budgets.
Okay. What is the sort of legal structure that we have historically? So we sort of built this partially around Alexander Hamilton. And I bet if anyone in the audience has one line about state debts that just sort of is hanging in the back of their head, it's about the federal government assuming state debts. So what is the system that we have built within this country with respect to the relationship between state governments and local governments and the federal government?
So scholars of fiscal federalism take the period pre-1840, including the Hamiltonian plan to assume state debts, as kind of the early period of federal-state relations in terms of fiscal federalism. In this period, the federal government, not only in the Hamiltonian period, but also after the War of 1812, and then with respect to the city of Washington, D.C., and a few other little things, would regularly take state debts and assume them for the power of the federal government. And this was understood by all as an effort to generate centralization. Right. So the idea of this was this federal government would assume the state debts, and that they would then have an incentive to have greater control over the states. Right. So because it would make sense to think that if you're going to assume places' debt, you're going to be worried about them taking them out in the future. And this was understood by Hamilton as a mechanism for cementing the power of the federal government vis-a-vis the states and in international affairs as well. In the 1840s is this big breakpoint. So one thing about fiscal federalism scholars that makes them different from all other people in the world, as far as I can tell, is they seem to think, I guess but they mostly seem to think that the crucial moment in American federalism was not, the beginning of the Civil War, the end of the Civil War, the Civil War. It's the rejection of the Johnson Report of 1843. What does that mean? Well, who is Johnson? What's going on? In following the Panic of 1837, states kind of held on for a little while. States had spent a huge amount of money in the 1830s on attempting to copy the Erie Canal. Two things: attempting to copy the Erie Canal and attempting to build state banks. And states at the same time decided they weren't so into taxes. The Erie Canal had famously paid for itself, particularly in its first period, and states thought they could build infrastructure and it would just pay for itself magically with tolls or economic development or something. And they built out these giant infrastructure projects and funded state banks and prayed. And then there was a huge panic. And they continued to borrow for a little while, but then they reached a point where they were on the edge of default. And Congress was asked to once again assume state debts. And Congress rejected this decision it's called the Johnson Report, which proposed it, and Congress rejected it. And this 8 states plus the territory of Florida defaulted on their debts, differing effects in different places. But this was this big moment where the federal government says, no, we are not going to bail out bankrupt states. This created a huge number of ripple effects in many different directions, one of which was the states started adopting these balanced budget and debt limit rules because they acknowledged that they were these tinderboxes for future debt problems. The other one is that for a period, America was deeply reliant on British loans, and British bankers refused to lend money to the federal government even for a period. The big effect this had, maybe the biggest, is that states in the 1840s were the biggest investors in things. They were building canals, they were doing the work. After the 1840s, states pull back really dramatically from building things, leaving the field to local governments. And so the first thing, well, I'm going to go through a little bit more of the history in a second, but the basic structure here is the federal government decided not to do bailouts in the 1840s. And it is believed, although it is less true than some seem to think, that this has been a relatively constant theme of fiscal federalism since. The federal government, generally speaking, does not bail out bankrupt states. And some people take this to mean the federal government is not involved in fiscal crises, which is not right. But the federal government generally, with a few exceptions, so like when Washington, D.C. went defaulted or got on the edge in the 1990s, the federal government did what was basically a bailout. And there are a few other instances that we can talk about later if you're interested. But this is the big thing. And so for scholars like Jonathan Rodden or Robert Inman, their idea is that this is the thing that makes American federalism. And what do they mean by that? They mean that if you had a situation where the federal government was bailing out states, there would be a moral hazard in the states. The states would realize they would be bailed out, and it would be like Brewster's Millions. They just start spending money left and right. And further, donor states would be unwilling to fund this unless the federal government could ensure greater control over the states. And so the point that particularly Rodden makes is that that bailouts are an unstable equilibrium. You can either have a situation in which there are no bailouts and states are left to fend for themselves, and they're relatively fiscally independent of the federal government. By the way, a lot's changed since the 1840s. I don't want to overstate how consistent things have been. A lot has changed, including a lot about the federal-state fiscal relations. But this is the idea Rodden advances, is that there's that if you can either have no bailouts and states are independent, or if you're going to do bailouts, the federal government's going to have a lot of incentives to regulate state taxing and debt issuance. The middle ground, Rodden and Inman argue, is a disaster, and is a middle ground like this, or is responsible for things like a couple of the financial crises we saw in Brazil and Argentina, where the federal government stood behind the states but did nothing to rein them in.
Okay. I'd also like to dig in a little bit about what you were talking about Hamilton and the concept of assuming state debts, centralizing power. Did his thesis hold, and are there ways that we can sort of see the initial approach of fiscal federalism carrying through to us today?
So the federal government is much more involved in state finance than it used to be, although it does not do the assuming state debts thing that it once did. Maybe it will, but it does not generally, or it has not. Federal government is much more involved in state finance, broadly speaking, so in two really big ways. One is the federal government subsidizes state debt issuance. So if you buy a municipal bond, it is exempt from federal taxes. And this is a way the federal government encourages states to invest money, and that's like a pretty big involvement in their affairs. The second thing is there's just a lot of programs. The federal government gives a lot of money to states. And so states operate Medicaid, but the federal government partially funds it. The federal government gives lots of money to education, 8 million other things. And so the federal government is much more involved in state finance than it was in Hamilton's day. But it doesn't take the form of assuming their debt. Mm-hmm. Again, maybe until now, we'll see.
It'll come back in a circle.
There you go.
Are there sort of any other historical concepts that you would want folks listening to sort of understand before we dig into the situation facing us?
Yeah, so one thing to say is that cities are different from states in a lot of respects. And so cities have, states are protected by sovereign immunity. This is actually a product of a later period of state defaults. States defaulted, almost all the southern states defaulted in the 1870s and 1880s, declaring that the Reconstruction era governments were, just bad, and so they didn't want to pay their debts. Crazy thing that people accepted this, but it led to, for the lawyers out there, like Hans versus Louisiana, that's a case from that period. But cities are different. Cities, federal courts have frequently intervened to make cities pay their debts over time. There are these wild cases in which the federal government operating under a slightly old legal regime, and I don't want to go into, if you lawyers want to talk about pre-Erie federal common law involving municipal debts, I can do that if you want, really. It's really interesting, actually. It's just a little bit far afield, maybe, for our current purposes. But cities can, first of all, that if they don't pay their debts, which is a more likely thing in a lot of ways than states not doing it, because states have a lot of power to tax. There's a lot of wealth inside a whole state. I mean, states are different sizes, but in a place like Illinois, there's just a lot of things going on. Therefore, there's a lot of theoretical power to tax. A city can get further out over its heels than a state can, being smaller. Federal courts have forced cities to pay in very amusing and crazy sorts of ways over time, and cities have come up with ways to not pay, which is kind of interesting. Through the 1870s and 1890s, the Supreme Court heard about 300 cases involving cities' efforts not to pay their debts in one version or another. They heard more cases about this than they heard on any other subject. And the cases are, the Supreme Court was like the enforcement arm for the municipal bond industry in this period. The Supreme Court issued, of those 300 cases, the municipal bond industry and investors won well over 200 of them. Cities and states got really desperate about what they would do. So one thing federal courts would do was force cities to issue orders, called mandamus orders, to force state and local officials to raise taxes. But they could only do that if there were local officials. So local officials started hiding to avoid federal issues. Sometimes state legislatures got it on the act. And so one of my favorite cases from this period is a case called Mobile versus Watson. And what happened was the city of Mobile was defaulting on its debt, on the edge of defaulting on its debt, or about to default on its debt. And the state legislature of Alabama passed a law creating a new city called the Port of Mobile. And the Port of Mobile was assigned the authority to tax all property, which is the only form of tax in Mobile, or almost all of the all the relevant property. They left a swamp or something. And then the new city, the Port of Mobile, bought all of the city of Mobile stuff. And debt holders were left holding a claim against this government that had no stuff and no taxes. And the Supreme Court just said no. They didn't even explain why. They said, you can't do that. I don't know what it is. You can't do that. That's bad. Into the present day, the Congress in the 1930s created a mechanism for judicially dealing with local defaults. We call it Chapter 9 or municipal bankruptcy. But it is a much bigger worry than states. The last state to default was in the 1930s. It was Arkansas. It could happen again. They are protected by sovereign immunity. Cities have a much weaker legal position, but they still have, in order to comply with constitutional limitations, even municipal bankruptcy leaves cities with a lot of capacity to structure their own, to restructure their debt through legal regime. And so cities still have a great deal of capacity to control what happens. And so one thing you see in a place like Detroit is that, so we've recently having a national debate of a sort about the idea of state bankruptcy. Which I can get into if you're interested. But one of the things you saw is that people that Majority Leader McConnell was like, this will, if they can go bankrupt, we don't want to pay for their pensions. One of the premises of this is that in municipal bankruptcy, pensions do particularly badly. This is what would get cut. In actual municipal bankruptcies, pensions have largely done much better than ordinary bondholders. And why is that? Well, the city on some level is still in charge of deciding. There's some fairness regimes put in by federal law, but the city has all of the political pressures that created the pension crisis in the first place, and that left it. And so they, pension holders in Detroit got, depending on how you think, it's well over 90 cents on the dollar, 95, whereas bondholders varied, but some of them got as little as 30 cents on the dollar. And so it is not the case that we remove politics when we start talking about these types of defaults. In fact, anyway, we get a heightened version of it.
Yeah. Short question posed by the audience. How do counties fit within this system?
So counties can file for bankruptcy under Chapter 9. They are a little different from cities in that they, depending on the context, can use sovereign immunity. It varies a little bit. Counties are a very variable form of government around the country. So for Yale people, Connecticut doesn't have counties. In New York City, counties are part of the city. In other places, counties are remarkably powerful. So in Los Angeles, you're talking about it's the biggest local government in America. It's giant, more than 10 million people. They have a lot of responsibilities, and so counties vary a lot. In some of them are very fiscally strapped. Some of them don't do anything. So it varies quite a lot.
Okay. So we have the historical basis. We sort of know where we are. You've mentioned some of the restraints that have been placed on states as they start thinking about how they're going to get themselves out of this hole, such as balanced budget requirements. Can you dig a little bit into what is open to states?
So states are required by law to, by most of their own laws, to do something approximating pass a balanced budget. This is an interesting area in which lawyers and economists diverge in how they understand the strictness of these rules. Economists, most famously Jim Paterba at MIT, have shown that in aggregate, balanced budget rules and debt limits, probably debt limits are more significant, act to restrain spending activity by states. And they encourage states to engage in this kind of cutting when they need to type activity. Lawyers focus on a different situation, which is they focus on all the ways you can get around them. And there are many ways to get around a balanced budget rule. A couple of notable ones that I can talk about. So in recent years, the biggest one has been to assume your pension is going to get very large returns when it's not, or to just underfund your pension, which is usually not understood as a form of debt for debt issuance or for debt limit, or as a problem for a balanced budget rule. States generally budget on a cash basis. They just count the dollars coming in and out and not about accruing liabilities. And so that's a big one. But states and cities have all sorts of other ways of getting around their balanced budget rules. One of my favorites is what are called lease and buyback arrangements. So the state of Arizona sold its state capital and then rented it back for 30 years with an agreement to buy it at the end. And so what they did was they got a sum of money and made regular payments and then made a lump sum payment at the end, which sounds like a bond, but it's backed by secured bonds that are backed by the state capitol building. But because it was structured as rental payments, it was understood not as a debt, but rather as a form of cash for keep it complying with your balanced budget rules. And this is absurd, but states have generally allowed, and there are all sorts of other tricks that lawyers can come up with. One way to think about this is that you follow balanced budget rules until you can avoid them, until you have incentive enough to come up with tricky enough ways around them. And maybe that the fact that it's tricky and slimy puts some political pressure on you not to do so. States in the current period are going to have to do a number of things. So one possibility is they just get a lot of federal aid. For those of you who work in Congress or you can tell me about the likelihood of that. It's certainly currently being debated. It is a question about how much aid they're going to get. Absent that, they have a couple of other options. One is cutting, which is they've been doing in very large numbers. They've been firing people left and right. Another related one is raising taxes. That would not be very popular in a recession. If you found out, you've lost your job and, oh, look, the sales tax has gone up, you're going to be a pretty unhappy voter. For cities, particularly, you're going to expect to see property taxes, which is the biggest form, depending where you are, but one of the biggest forms of local tax. Property taxes have been pretty steady because property values haven't fallen that much, but there are a lot of people who can't pay them. And so people would be pretty unhappy about this. Another thing you could do is borrow if you can. So if you're not at your debt limit, or if you can come up with a way to do it, this is what the Federal Reserve's program is about encouraging short-term borrowing less than 36 months. The other thing you can do is engage in financial engineering. And so you saw this, for those of you who've spent any time reading or thinking about or living through the New York City debt crisis in 1975, this was the main innovation of that crisis, was that the state, on behalf of the city, created a new entity called the Municipal Assistance Corporation, or the MAC, or Big Mac, that got some of the city's taxing authority and issued new bonds backed by this new taxing authority, and that gave the city access to new financing that it didn't otherwise have. It was a way of creating a kind of bankruptcy remote secured financing. Other places in crises have done this over time. So Puerto Rico created the COFINA, which for bonds, which are basically a direct copy in a lot of ways of the MAC. And Illinois recently created a sales tax securitization that's, again, bears a strong familial relationship with this. And so this may give you access to allow you to borrow in this other way. Whether these things hold up legally is still unknown. A lot of depending on jurisdiction, how it's going to work. But that is something I expect you're going to see, is some financial engineering in addition to leaning on the Federal Reserve or the good graces of the municipal bond market to help them see them through, in addition to cutting spending and raising taxes.
So if you don't cut, and you don't get money from the federal government, and you don't engage in financial engineering, it would seem the only other option is default. So can you talk about default, especially if the Senate Majority Leader is pushing states in that direction? Well,
so the Senate Majority Leader was, while he was kind of spoke somewhat loosely, was proposing the creation of a state bankruptcy regime that was a kind of way to organize default, is I think the best way to put it. It's states have the power to default right now. they're sovereign entities, and no one can make them pay if they don't want to. States don't have a lot of assets in other jurisdictions that you can seize. They're protected in federal court through the 11th Amendment. They are they're sovereign, and so they don't have to pay. And so over the course of American history, states have defaulted. Again, the last one was the 1930s. Arkansas actually defaults in the 1840s and the 1870s and the 1930s, kind of the American Argentina. And by the way, this has had really terrible effects on Arkansas as well as on Argentina. Arkansas, because of its series of defaults, wasn't able to borrow to build infrastructure at the time when that was a really important thing to do. Still an important thing to do, but it was a really important thing to do around the turn of the last century. It's no accident that Arkansas is the second poorest state. Default has really, I mean, theoretically, people won't lend you money. That's really bad for you. But that said, they can default if they want. And no one can stop them from doing so. They don't want to. And again, we haven't seen this since the 1930s. It would have very bad, there's questions about what effects it would have. So if there's questions about contagion, if we saw a default in Illinois, would no one lend to Michigan? There's concerns about the effect it would have on the future, on kind of would they be able to borrow in the future. There's a reason this hasn't happened very much in the last 100 years, because it's a scarring, miserable experience. And places are more excited about the idea of raising taxes in the midst of a big recession than they are about defaulting, because defaulting is really, really brutal on a place. But it is still a theoretical possibility.
Okay. I'd like to ask about a not state. So many of the folks on this call are in DC or the general environment. DC isn't a state. DC has other concerns. Can you talk about how DC differs and what it might look like for DC versus, I don't know, Maryland or Virginia?
So DC is not a state. And it's notably in the 1990s, it got on the edge of fiscal, was in a fiscal crisis, and the federal government changed its fiscal relationship with the city in a way that amounted to, I think you can understand, is about basically DC had been saddled with debts from the pre-home rule era, and the federal government, in return for not giving another stream of money, assumed those debts, or reassumed them. I don't know how to think about it, but they did. DC is, interestingly, in a lot of ways, a very risky proposition, which is that it's most states have a multiplicity of metropolitan areas that can go up when the other one goes down. And so, like, upstate New York has been in decline for a long time now, but it's been able to fiscally prop itself up with the broad economic success of downstate. DC, there's only one other state that is all in one metropolitan area, Rhode Island, and even Rhode Island, Westerly is technically not in the Providence metropolitan statistical area, but it's, and that makes DC a bit of a riskier proposition. It's heavily reliant on the federal government and on like kind of the lobbying economy for its growth. It also has real limits on its capacity to tax that are driven through the Home Rule Act, through what Congress limited their ability to tax. And so DC has some problems. DC is kind of on the heels of a period of extraordinary economic success. So for those of you who lived, I used to live in DC, and it's been growing and economically successful for the last 20 years in ways that it had not been. In the period from the 70s to the 90s, DC lost population faster than any other state-like jurisdiction in America. So DC is in some ways a healthy place. On the other hand, there are reasons to be worried about DC as an operation.
Okay. Let's talk about generally about sort of where state budgets go, but let's start with one of the topics that has just sort of been peppered through your discussion, and that is pensions. Can you elaborate on sort of the role pensions play in state budgets and what we might expect to see around pensions moving forward.
So I think to think about pensions, you have to think about two different things. One is the cost of providing pensions, like are we giving workers too much money for the services rendered? And the second one is whether we're paying for them in the period in which we are getting the service. So we require places to build a pension fund because the idea is that when we consume some sort of government service, our kids are educated by their first grade teacher. We are paying them in two ways. One is in salary today, and the other one is we are promising to pay them a pension in the future. And in theory, you should pay for the services when you receive them because the people who are there now are the ones receiving them. Future residents are not necessarily receiving them. States, because of their debt limits and for a couple of other reasons, have largely many states, not all states, but many states or some states have very substantially underfunded their pensions. And so what that means is it's basically a form of debt. They received the service in 1992 or whatever it is they received the service, but they didn't pay for it, and they're making people in the future pay for it. So one way to think about this is that if you are in New Haven, Connecticut, you are paying not only for the schools that you're receiving today, but you're also paying for the schools that someone else received 20 years ago. It's just a form of debt. Now, pensions payments have increased over time. We've shifted as jurisdictions were faced with budget problems or just over desire not to pay taxes or whatever it was they were doing. They rather than paying salaries now, made greater promises to future residents. So that they say, instead of giving you a salary increase, we'll give you a bigger pension going forward. And they underfunded those pensions. Not everywhere, but some places. And so, but jurisdictions did this differently. So New York State's pensions are relatively well funded. Not necessarily its OPEB liabilities, which I'll get into in 1 second, but its pension liabilities are relatively well funded. They're very rich, but they're very well funded, right? So the New York State put money into the bank to pay for it. Other jurisdictions didn't do this. Further jurisdictions added other promises to future workers. People in the field call this OPEB liability, but it's basically retiree health care. We made a whole variety of promises to public workers to pay their health care in the future. In most jurisdictions, we didn't save up money for this purpose, and this is a very big pressure on jurisdictions. So the way I think about, or I think you should think about pensions, is that they're just a form of debt. In most states, they are constitutionally protected. The degree of constitutional protection varies by place, but they are just like a bond is constitutionally. A bond is protected by the contract clause. States are not allowed to impair bonds. In many states, you have constitutional provisions that say you cannot impair or diminish pension obligations. And even in other places, you have other types of constitutional protections. And the result is that it's a form of debt. In many jurisdictions, it's the largest form. So one thing I want to say about this. One is that it's also a particularly problematic form of debt because if you borrow money to build a bridge, you have a bridge. If you borrow money to receive teaching services, you may have smarter kids, you may not, they may move out or whatever it is, but you don't have an asset that belongs to the state. The same way that if you borrow money to go to a restaurant as a person, it's more problematic than borrowing money to pay for a car, right? Because you have an asset. And so it's a problematic form of debt in that respect, but it is just a form of borrowing that states had a lot of incentives to use because of their debt limit rules.
Another sort of big area of state action, and one that's particularly important right now in the middle of a pandemic, is healthcare spending. So how can you cut back on healthcare spending if we're in a situation where states need to cut back, but you need to not only provide very expensive healthcare, but also new kinds of healthcare related funding like massive contract tracing forces?
It's a huge problem. So Medicaid spending has been the largest growing part of state budgets for a long time now, as Medicaid expenses have grown more slowly, private expenses, but they've grown very, very substantially over time. And this has put a very large pressure on all the rest of state budgets. The increased spending on Medicaid, which is decreased spending on roads and on higher education and 8 million other things. In a crisis, cutting healthcare spending is particularly problematic. Partially because the states get matching money from the federal government for their healthcare spending. And so if you cut it by more, you cut it by what you're spending, and you cut it by what you'd be getting from the federal government. And that is particularly painful. We largely think of when the Urban Institute did a study of what part of state budgets are fixed, they treated the Medicaid share as fixed, because they thought no one would be daft enough to cut their Medicaid. Some jurisdictions have proposed it, and like New York State's going through a complicated politics around cutting Medicaid. But it is a difficult thing to do. Further, public hospitals are, in many ways, are governments also, and they've faced extraordinary budget pressures in the current period, in the coronavirus period, because of the stopping of non-essential medical services. So hospitals are in an you'd think of all things to be in fiscal pressure, the one thing you'd expect would be full hospitals. They'd be doing fine, but they're actually all private and public hospitals in extraordinarily financial hard straits, because they make most of their money from knee surgeries and other things, and we have not been doing that. So of governments, they're one of the worst hurt. They're one of the worst hurt sectors. There are other sectors that are also particularly badly hurt. For those of you who are interested, convention centers, which are generally independent governments, which are reliant on convention center money, and traditionally hotel taxes, are in a world of hurt also. So there are a bunch of specialized government, also transit agencies, mass transit agencies are in particularly bad shape.
One of the big areas of cutting under the last recession was teacher and education spending. And we sort of saw that culminate last year in a series of labor actions around education spending. Now, if we're back in a situation where cutting is going to occur, how are the sort of preferences that were being articulated last year going to come to a head with the need to cut?
That's a great question, but it is. I suspect that in education and in other areas, that if there's not increased federal aid, you're going to see a period of substantial labor strife, where workers. So you're referring to the Red for Ed protests that were quite politically popular. The double whammy of their pension obligations and their decline is going to put school districts in a huge amount of fiscal pressure, and then when you throw on top of it the new costs associated with distance learning, and a very complicated thing to do to figure out how to run a school if you have to shut it down, what you have to do, you've got to come up with all sorts of technical stuff about cleaning it and all the stuff that's going to make education really complicated. I suspect you're going to see extraordinary, and again, absent a substantial amount of federal aid, you're going to see very large cuts in these areas, and that's going to be painful and unpleasant, and people are going to be unhappy. And so I suspect you will see all sorts of anger around this. Again, how the politics will work out is I don't know. It's a very hard thing to predict what's gonna. I imagine it will be varied across place. But it's I think it's a safe bet to bet on, in the absence of a very substantial amount of federal aid or some magic for the economy, that you will see a huge amount of strife when jurisdictions cut services people really like education.
So you mentioned federal.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Okay.
Federal aid. If we do get federal aid for states, what kind of conditions on the funding might you see?
That's a great question. So again, remember when I was talking about the question of if the federal government is bailing places out, it's likely to put very strong conditions on it. So the types of aid that have been proposed thus far are sometimes described as bailouts, but they have not been. And no one has actually, with the exception of some actors like the Speaker of the Illinois State Senate, or the head president of the Illinois State Senate, have called for bailouts. They've called for money to go to all states. And if you're giving money to all states, it doesn't have any of the moral hazard concerns, because if you're a state that's well fiscally run, you still like money. Everyone likes money. And you can spend it on tax cuts or paving your roads with gold or whatever it is you want to do. And to think of something like the CARES Act, which distributed $150 billion to states and cities as a bailout, is just like a category error. It's a mistake, because it went to Utah is like the best governed, fiscally governed state in the country, and Utah got more as a share of its per population than New York or Illinois did. Vermont got way more, because there's no one lives in Vermont, and there's a minimum amount of people per state, dollars per state. You could, in the CARES Act, you saw some conditions on the actual expenditure of the money. The money was tied to being spent on COVID-related costs that were not previously budgeted for, and there's a time frame in which you have to spend the money. This was lousy mostly. It didn't make a ton of sense, because it forced the states into either basically lying, so that you can classify, here's my expense, it's my state university has a problem, I'm going to give money to it in its COVID recovery fund or something, or facing really strong constraints on their ability to spend the money, which means they can't allocate it to their greatest needs. And so, like, why they did that is to me less than perfectly clear, at least as a policy matter. I can understand some of the politics. What you might see in a future act is really an interesting question. I think, for what it's worth, that there are reasons that that Congress should attach certain conditions to a big aid, but it's not the kind. What you should try to avoid is things that limit the spending of the money in this period. The reason you're giving money to states and cities is to avoid them firing people, because that will have a negative effect on the macroeconomy. And if your conditions create an effect that states and cities have some inability to spend the money and spend the money quickly, you're not going to get the macroeconomic effect that you're seeking. The teachers will be fired, and then that's bad, and so we shouldn't. Right, and so that's you could imagine the federal government attaching conditions about ensuring the states are in better shape going forward. So I proposed, for instance, tying mandatory accounting rules, adopting accrual accounting rather than cash accounting, and tying it to the aid and to the ability to issue income tax exempt municipal bonds going forward as a way to force states to keep their acts in order going forward. And the federal government has an interest in this also. So if the federal government wants to solve a problem in the current period, and the state's going to take some of that money and devote it to its past cost, or devote the money to current expenditure and then take the money they were going to spend on that and devote it to its debts, the federal government's going to get less bang for its buck in the current period. And so the federal government has an interest in states being fiscally healthy. And so there's a reason they would do that. But in the current period, the one thing you'd want to avoid doing is attaching conditions that stop the money from being spent.
Great. So we have a number of questions. So I'd like to turn to the Q&A and let folks ask. But before that, is there any sort of wrap up or summary that you would like to provide before we get into some nitty gritty details?
That's great. I'm trying to think of the best thing. States and cities are remarkably important. I mean, that seems anodyne, but it's they do most of governmental employment, and they provide a huge amount of our investment in the future. There's a joke that the federal government is a insurance company with an army. It pays for social. It's not a very funny joke, but it is what it is. It's you laughed. It's pretty good. But to the extent that we invest in the future through government, a huge amount of the effort goes through states and cities. And people who think about states and cities frequently think about their regulatory abilities, like who's going to regulate abortion or who's going to regulate something of that sort, and spend less time thinking about their important role as investors in the future. We have been decreasing our investment in the future, and that is surely likely to have effects on growth as states have had to spend more money on healthcare expenditures which are consumed today, and on failing to have saved in the past through their pension and debt obligations. And that's going to be a bad thing for the economy going forward. So if we can't come up with a way to make states more efficacious in their assigned role of building the future, states and cities, we are going to suffer, not just those states, but the whole country, right? So if Washington, D.C. doesn't pay enough for education, everyone in the country suffers because people go to school and they move around and they'll be worse at things, and that's bad. So I think that focusing on these issues is really, really important if you care about education or infrastructure or the future, and which I suspect is most of you. So I at least hope so. I think it's a crucial issue to be focused on.
Great, so we are going to switch now to the Q&A. My name is Miyako and I'm the club admin for ColumbiaDC. So we wanted to thank both of you so much for engaging in this conversation. We have a lot of questions. So everybody, if you're reading this, the order that we do the questions in is by raising your hand. So if you can click on the raise your hand button, it puts us in an order for you to be able to be unmuted and ask your question to our panel. If that doesn't work for you for whatever reason, then once we get through all of the raised hands, we will get to the typed Q&As. But we do prefer to have everybody speak their own question if they can. Once you are unmuted, if you can just let us know your school affiliation and your name, just because we have a couple of different schools here. So we will start with, we have a few questions coming in. The order as it is now is James Query, then Stun Bernold, Laura Tossi, and Jackie Kremos. So we'll start with James. If again, just tell us your affiliation and then you can ask your question.
Yes, I'm with, my affiliation is the Yale School of Management, and I'd be really interested, though it's a little bit afield from what you've been talking about so far, comparing the federal-state relationship in the U.S. with some of the issues that Europe have encountered in trying to establish a stronger European Union and a different kind of federalism, which I've always thought that the U.S. model had interesting lessons for them, but there doesn't seem to be much exchange.
So it's a great question. European states who are in the euro, European countries who are in the euro, face a similar type of problem as U.S. states in that they are borrowing in a currency they don't control, and so there are limits on their capacity to finance their debts. In the current period, there are big proposal to issue EU-issued debts that are going to fund projects in member countries, mostly in the southern countries that are most hard hit by the COVID crisis, that are going to be backed by the EU as a whole's ability to pay. How they're going to do the taxing to support the bonds is still less than perfectly clear. It seems like it's going to come from kind of healthy contributions, but we'll see. People are calling this possibility Europe's Hamiltonian moment, in that this is effectively an effort to assume state debt, like Greek or Italian debts, into a broader European entity. And so Europe is currently struggling with these issues as we speak. And so people in Europe are unbelievably closely, people will call you and be like, tell me all about, the post-1812 assumption of state debts. They're very focused on it, and it's something that people have been paying a lot of attention to. The EU is not organized the way the US government is in terms of its capacity to tax, but that could change also. So particularly if you start seeing the EU issuing more debt. So right now, the reason it's such a great question is that this is exactly what's on the minds of European policymakers right now.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is from Stun Bernold. I'm unmuting you now.
Thank you. I'm an alumnus of Cornell, Yale, and Harvard. I live in Connecticut. As you mentioned, Connecticut is a state with a lot of financial trouble. And I've heard, especially from Republican candidates for office, that the way out is to essentially refuse to pay the pensions that the state of Connecticut is obligated to pay. Would that be legal? Is there a way that a state such as Connecticut could just default on its pensions?
So a state can, it's a great question. State can, because it is has sovereign immunity, a state can default on it. It can't be forced to pay. You can't go into court to force a state to pay its debts. Pensions in Connecticut, particularly the vested portion of them, are protected by state constitutional law, the same way that bonds are. And so if a state refused to pay its pensions, it would be understood to be in default of its debts, and it would create a whole world of problems. But in default, a state can decide whom to pay and whom not to pay. And so in theory, they could pay their bondholders and not their pensioners. I suspect they won't do that. This would be understood as a default on its debts, and would be understood as a massive crisis, and would create all sorts of implications for parts of its bond holdings and other sorts of things, and contract obligations. It would be a huge mess. Could it? Kinda, yes. Again, the pensions are protected under state law the same way as bonds are, somewhat like bonds are. And a failure to pay would be understood as a catastrophic event. The first state default since the 1930s. The relative status of pensions and bonds is a really interesting question. It's come up a lot in municipal bankruptcies, but states aren't bound by the strictures of municipal bankruptcy when they default, and have a lot of political free range. So in a default, they could choose to do lots of different things. Why you'd expect them not to pay their pensions is, not obvious to me that that's what they would decide to do. They may not pay the bondholders. Likely, I think for it's worth that Connecticut's not going to be faced with either one of those choices. That Connecticut is going to be in a long period of slowly raising taxes and cutting expenditure in a kind of depressing, long march towards fiscal responsibility. Connecticut got into fiscal trouble by not saving at all for its pensions, roughly speaking, until the 1980s. And so they have this giant hole in their pension funding, and it's going to take a long time to dig out of it. So theoretically, I guess they could. It's a little crazy as an idea, I think, or at least a little reckless. This would be a simple, straightforward thing. It would not be. Great question, though.
Our next question is from Laura Tossi. You might have to unmute yourself, Laura.
Yes, it's actually David Schleicher. I'm using my wife's computer. Thank you. It's a wonderful view you've given us here. As you know, Puerto Rico was in trouble before the COVID depression. Do you have a view of how that is likely to play out, and what you would recommend be the approach the United States should take regarding Puerto Rico's desperate situation?
So really good question. So just to back up for people who haven't paid too much attention to Puerto Rico, starting in the 1990s, the federal government removed certain tax benefits it gave to firms to locate in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has a special power to borrow, though. If any of you own municipal bonds, you might know something about this, which is if you lend money, buy a bond of your state, it's exempt from your state's income taxes. And if it's your city has an income tax, it's exempt from that city's income taxes. we call those bonds triple tax exempt. So if you're a New York City resident and you borrow and you buy a New York City bond, you don't pay city income taxes, state income taxes, or federal income taxes. Puerto Rico bonds are triple tax exempt everywhere in the country. And so broadly speaking, as Puerto Rico's economy declined with these declining tax benefits, they borrowed a ton. And eventually this became extremely untenable. And in in the late period, part of the Obama presidency, it defaulted on its debt. And they did a whole bunch of other things. I'm like skipping through a huge amount of the story here, but Congress passed a law that, first of all, created a control board to oversee its budgeting decisions, and created a mechanism for Puerto Rico to file for something like bankruptcy. And that bankruptcy case is still going through the courts. They had proposed what's called a plan of adjustment for getting out of it. The amount of write-downs bondholders are going to have to take in order to leave Puerto Rico on a fiscally firm footing going forward. Of course, but with lots of other things, a hurricane, it's really bad. What they had to do that, that the final decision on that has been tabled due to the COVID crisis. What would I do? I suspect the two things I would do is I would require all creditors, bondholders and pensioners, to take slightly deeper haircuts than are in the original plan, to put it on a firmer fiscal footing going forward. And the second thing is something that my colleague, Judge Jose Cabranes, who's on the Second Circuit, has proposed, which is recreating some of those tax subsidies in order to get, they were largely done for pharmaceuticals. And in a period when we're very concerned about the availability of pharmaceuticals, to have domestic production of them, it seems like you might be able to help solve Puerto Rico's problems while helping solving America's medical security problem by recreating some of those tax subsidies. I'm generally not a fan of tax subsidies of the locational form, but in this case, because of America's particular and strange relationship with Puerto Rico, I think that it might be advisable.
Okay, our next question is from Jackie Kremos. Jackie, again, you might have to unmute yourself. Okay, I'm not sure if she's there, but she did submit a question, so I'll go ahead and just read that. And she says, apologies if you covered this earlier, but where do pensions fall in terms of what pensioners get in the event of a state default? Is it before bondholders?
So no, pensions are unsecured debt, just like general obligation debt is. Again, a state can decide to pay what it wants to, because again, no one can sue it to make it pay anything. In municipal bankruptcies, this has become a really big debated question, which is, to what extent are cities required to pay all unsecured creditors an equal amount? That would be what you'd think of as the kind of the very traditional bankruptcy rule. In practice, in municipal bankruptcies, there have been some where bondholders have done much better, but most pensioners have done much better. A number of jurisdictions have kind of turned general obligation bonds, ordinary bonds, into secured debt. I've created what's called a statutory lien. But in most other situations, cities propose what's called a plan of adjustment for getting out of municipal bankruptcy. And in such a document, they propose something, and the court requires it to be in the best interest of creditors. The law requires it to be the best interest of creditors, which is understood to mean better than you would do if there was no bankruptcy case, which is easily met. And then they impose some kind of fairness requirement. And this became a really big issue in the Detroit bankruptcy. Pensioners, due to the efforts of nonprofits, and particularly due to the efforts of nonprofits and the state government, were treated much better than a number of other types of unsecured bondholders, unsecured creditors, and particularly bondholders. And the court had to address whether that was complied with a fairness requirement in Chapter 9. The court said yes, and they focused on a couple of things. They said it would be in the greater long-term interest of the city, their ability to hire people, and this is somewhat questionable, but this is what they said. The second thing is they said that the pension clause in the state constitution justified a kind of special treatment for pensioners. And the third thing they said is that like pensioners are often in very, very bad fiscal straits, financial straits, not fiscal, financial straits. Their pensions are very often not very large. And this may justify differential treatment. In another municipal bankruptcy case that where pensioners got 100 cents on the dollar, the court said, well, pensioners are getting 100 cents on the dollar, but current employees are getting fired, and we think of that as kind of one account. The thing you can take from this is cities, not states, by the way, again, is that in these city bankruptcies, the city retains certain ability to treat its creditors differently, subject to some kind of outside restrictions created by the courts, and the courts have been relatively liberal in their treatment. A state, because there's no legal requirements on it to, can just not pay if it so chooses. The debt doesn't get extinguished, but they can just not pay. They can repudiate it. This will have dramatic effects on it going forward, but it's something they can choose to do. But there's no legal right for pensioners to be a higher class of debt than ordinary debt. They don't get paid first necessarily. In political practice, they do get paid more, although they usually take some type of haircut. It's usually not 100 cents on the dollar, it's something less than that. They get their COLAs cut or other things happen. But it is subject to a great deal of politics.
Okay, great. We have one more hand raised that I will allow to unmute. I do just want to acknowledge in the DC area, we are experiencing some pretty massive thunderstorms right now. So I know that some people might be cutting in it or freezing, but we are recording this and I will send out the recording afterwards just in case you do miss anything. All right, Oren, you are up next.
I think I've successfully unmuted. Okay. 2 degrees from Yale College and Harvard Law School, 52 years as a pension lawyer specializing in public plans.
An expert.
I have a Rube Goldberg idea, and it's stimulated by the thought that there are several pension plans in the Chicago area that have less than 2 or 3 years left to pay the pensions that they're already obligated to pay. And the sponsor of the pension plan is in horrible shape. The city of Chicago is living on borrowed money. The
School district too, yeah.
Yeah, okay. My research tells me that a constitutional right can be waived. So that an individual with a constitutional right to a pension could waive that constitutional right. The reason for waiver would be that if the federal government were to enact a type of insurance policy similar, modeled on the PBGC, and open that up, and if a person was a participant in a plan that was looking to run out of money, could the participant agree to take a haircut in exchange for the guarantee by a federal agency such as the PBGC?
So sure, yes. This is a very Hamiltonian solution. This is a federal assumption of state debts. It's with an interesting creation kind of mechanism that you're creating. It's an interesting idea, but the federal government would have to agree to take on Chicago's debts, but would not be providing an equal amount of money to someplace that's not in trouble. I don't know, Greenwich, Connecticut. They could do this. There's some interesting questions about whether a state could, the Congress could effectively mandate state pension programs to go into something like ERISA, which is the the statutory thing that leads to the pension guarantee. They put certain restrictions on state pension funding of the type you see in ERISA. And there's a debate about this, about whether this is possible. I'm somewhat skeptical, but a student wrote a paper about it. There's pretty convincing, suggests that it's at least theoretically possible. The idea of effectively bailing out pensions without imposing restrictions is exactly the kind of thing that Rodden was somewhat skeptical of, or accepted as a feasible solution, because what's to stop Chicago from just underfunding its pensions even more, or issuing new promises, or what have you? You'd expect to see, as we saw with the creation of ERISA, both restrictions and backstopping as part of one project. Whether the restrictions would be constitutional is a interesting question. But it's the willingness to provide the money is really the absent the restrictions is the kind of thing that is the kind of subject of this long literature on fiscal federalism. It's a really interesting idea. I suspect that in particularly the next Congress, we're going to see lots of creative ideas of a whole variety of sorts on this score. And so I think it's kind of a neat kind of hook into this broader discussion. So thank you very much. But by the way, one thing is that Chicago is really in very, 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 very deep trouble. And it's a whole bunch of governments in Chicago. As the question noted, it's the city. So Chicago is probably the most indebted city. It's definitely the most indebted city relative to revenues. The Chicago School District is one of the most indebted school districts relative to revenues. Cook County is one of the most indebted, though it's slightly less, most indebted counties relative to revenues, and the state of Illinois is definitely the most indebted state relative to revenues. And so how to deal with these overlapping governments is a very, very wicked problem that I've been quite focused on. And so if anyone's interested, you can email me afterwards to talk about that. But it is a unbelievably wicked problem to see what would happen if all of them went into crisis at once at the same time.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to move to the question and answer now. We have one question that says, you say budgets are more volatile now with income tax as their base. What did states use in the past, and should they alter their approach now?
So obviously there are a lot of values involved in what states. So states traditionally relied much more on sales than property taxes. Local governments still to this day rely on property taxes very extensively. States relied more on sales taxes and fees and a whole variety of other sources of revenues that were more stable. Now, sales taxes have gotten worse because so much more of our economy is in services which are not covered by sales taxes, and sales taxes are regressive. And so if you want to build progressivity into state income taxes, it's almost a necessary component that you're going to create more volatility. You could imagine having the federal government do all of the progressivity and states not being progressive and therefore not having this problem of volatility. But if you don't think that you don't want to do that, then what you need to do is in good times save a lot more. And so the question of like what states should do, well, states said there are a lot of values involved here, like so how progressive do we want our states? How do we want to deal with inequality inside states? How worried are we about exit? So that people will leave states, which is the research on this is somewhat varied. But another worry with high income taxes that people will leave states. The research thus far has shown that people have people do leave states in response to income taxes, but it's a relatively limited number. But some states are extremely sensitive to this, particularly states that are reliant on very, very, very rich people, like Connecticut. But the most famous example of this is when David Tepper left New Jersey for Florida, this big hedge fund guy. The legislature had to go into special session because they had lost so much income tax revenue. And so this is an unhealthy state of affairs, but whether the states or someone else should respond to it is a very big question. So I don't have a single answer to what state should tax. Well, I have many answers, but it is definitely a cost of relying heavily on income taxes that they are so volatile. It puts a huge amount of pressure on the state to save when the times are good, which they generally don't.
Okay, here's one more. He says, this is from Walter Dellinger. He says, this is a way to think about the present situation. The coronavirus has inflicted an enormous economic loss on the US. Rationally, we would want to spread this loss over a large number of years. Badly imbalanced budgets are a rational way of spreading the loss over time. If you could comment on that.
Yeah, so this is absolutely true. It's it makes sense to not. It makes sense for two reasons. One is that you are you're spreading the loss across. That there's no reason to say that today's residents should pay all of the cost of created by coronavirus. We could just the same way we finance a bridge over time, we could think of financing the hole created by a natural disaster or a pandemic over a course of time. Further, the cutting into a recession has these particularly nasty effects. In many ways, I think one of the questions that we've been talking about here, though, is how do you institutionally create that type of rule? So one solution for the federal government is extremely easy because people will lend money to the federal government a roughly infinite amount, so they'll lend it for free at the moment. And the federal government can therefore spread the cost over many periods. States face some limits in their capacity to do so. And so if the federal government won't, for whatever reason, states can come up with ways to borrow, but these can become very costly for state in a way they are not for the federal government. So the broad principle is correct. The institutional mechanisms for doing so rely on either a complex situation if the federal government's not going to do it, or political will in Congress.
Okay, great. We had one more hand raised, so I will open it up to Kate Halabi. You can answer or ask your question now.
Thank you. I graduated in 2019 from Yale College, and I'm wondering what you think will be the tipping point or the impetus for states to adjust their pension obligations, which have been accumulating for so many years.
It's a great question. I mean, so again, remember that their pension obligations are just, for purposes, largely just a form of debt, right? So they're just a way to avoid complying with their balanced budget or debt limit rules. They'd rather not, so in 2019, they would rather not have raised taxes or cut spending to pay their pension obligations. Again, one thing to remember is that many states are fine. So it's not all states that are in deep trouble. Some states, so Utah, is totally fine. Many states are in that situation. But what will force states to do so is I think the way to think about this is that in the next recovery, will states go slow in reinvesting in all the things that people are going to want in order to best prepare themselves for kind of deal with their long-running debt problems? There is a huge incentive on behalf of kind of from politicians to get stuff now and worry about the future later. That's a pretty natural worry. It's from voters too. The reason is for politicians. History suggests that in huge crises, you see constitutional or other efforts. So following the defaults of the 1840s, you saw the rise of balanced budget and debt limit rules. Following the municipal defaults of the 1870s to the 1890s, you saw limits on state debt, on municipal debt issuance. If you see states in very, very, very rough situations, it wouldn't be totally shocking to see them attempt to respond to their crisis by establishing constitutional rules going forward that require, for instance, funding their pensions in advance. So Illinois, somewhat famously, when they passed their constitutional amendment protecting pensions as a contract right, so the same status as bonds, considered adopting a rule that said that it is a requirement on the state legislature to pre-fund pensions. They chose not to do this because they thought that the legal pressure of having to pay would be enough to force the legislature to do so. This was probably a mistake, and you could imagine seeing that reversed. Another thing you might see, and you've seen in a few jurisdictions, is a move away from defined benefit pensions towards defined contribution. You've seen this in the private sector. Most of you, I'm sure, have 401ks rather than, or other forms of pre-savings that are aren't tied to a promise to pay in the future by the entity. It's possible some jurisdictions decide they're not going to be responsible enough going forward, and you could think of this as a type of constitutional change, although it's not like written in the Constitution, to move away from defined benefit arrangements to defined contribution. This basically shifts the risk away from the state and to the worker, which is worse for the worker and has all sorts of other potentially negative effects in terms of, a lot more money will end up going to Wall Street or whatever. But it's possible that you see more of that. I suspect you will.
Okay, I'm going to combine some questions. There's a lot of interest on how certain city or state governments got into such trouble. How did other cities manage to do so well? Are there certain conditions on like federal money that we see in fiscally healthy states, or would some of those conditions be like hypothetical proposals that we haven't seen before?
So, I mean, look, it's a big country and there are a lot of different political cultures around the country that have developed different response. So why are some places doing well and some places doing badly? Well, if you imagine you've got lots of places, it stands to reason that they're not all going to be the same. They're all governed by different political coalitions and different situations. One question to ask is why some jurisdictions have fallen into particular problems. And of course, every place has its own story. Question is like why you've seen this. And I've got, depending on your jurisdiction, you can have different stories. It's not necessarily the case that every jurisdiction is. So take Connecticut. Connecticut had a kind of long period of assuming nothing bad would ever happen. It was the fast growing people are moving from New York. This is the Mad Men era. And it just didn't save it all because it thought the good times would never end. And that's a different story than you see. And since the 2000s, Connecticut's been in a kind of a depressing but much more realistic political world than New Jersey, whose political attitude towards its pensions is kind of more YOLO. What if we just didn't save for our pensions? What would happen then? Oh, we'll find out, I guess. One interesting problem about cities that I can go into, that to a place where I'm definitely on a little more sure footing, is that there's a really interesting idea created by a political scientist named Esther Fuchs, who asked the question, why in the 1970s did New York get near default, but Chicago was fine? And the answer she offered was something that is that was kind of somewhat surprising in many ways. Her argument was that the demise of the political machine in New York, the demise of Tammany Hall, which happened much earlier in New York than happened in Chicago with the kind of then still powerful Mayor Daley, resulted in intense policy demanders in New York being able to ask for goodies. Every group in a somewhat, so again, you don't have strong political parties in cities, you don't have like a competition, and so every single group kind of asks for what they wanted and got it over the course of the 60s and early 70s. In Chicago, in contrast, there were no political benefits to giving small favors to groups here and there because all politicians were completely dependent on Mayor Daley, who had a global vision for the city. And so that's the answer Fuchs gives for why Chicago was healthy when New York was not. New York, after the 1970s fiscal crisis, imposes legal restrictions on its budget. It is required to account in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles as a terms of the bailout or quasi-bailout, or whatever you want to think about what happened in 1975. Chicago starts getting to really strong fiscal pressure at the end of the younger Daley administration, as the as the machine begins to decline, in the sense that there's no one centralizing force governing Chicago. Intense policy demanders can ask for more things, and so the answer Fuchs gives about this, or the answer Fuchs would give with respect to this going forward, well, you could ask her, she's still around, is that it is the weakness of democratic systems. The lack of centralizing figures in these cities that leave them prey to kind of intense policy demanders asking for goodies, and the need of politicians to, bribe groups of voters effectively. There's a lot more there. Again, it's a big country that not all political failures are the same. But the place to look here is into the place's politics, in the sense of like what structurally about its politics makes it different. And so again, places will be different in the way their reasons for this.
Okay, at Columbia, a lot of our alumni are very interested in, we follow Alexander Hamilton. And we did build this a little bit on Hamilton. And so we have some alumni asking if you can tie it a little bit more to Hamilton. And one question from Ron asking if Thomas Jefferson opposed Hamilton's federal financial plans as the musical Hamilton suggested.
Yes, so really good. So yes, he did until he didn't. That's the story in the musical, which is based on the Ron Chernow Hamilton biography, is broadly true. I think it doesn't do the great job of describing Hamilton's reasons for his assumption of state debts plan, but it's broadly true. So for those wondering about that, yes, that's basically right. Hamilton, his big plan in the first Congress was for the federal government to assume state debts, to do the equivalent of what today would be the federal government agreeing to pay off Illinois, but for all states, to pay off their debts as part of the broader federal budget. You could think of it as a giant bailout. And so when we have a politics of bailouts today, you could think of the pro-bailout position as the Hamiltonian position. And what effect does this have, and why was Hamilton in favor of it? Well, he wanted a powerful central government. The creation of a huge stock of now federal debt would strengthen, and then you'd have to create taxes to pay for that, would strengthen the federal government vis-a-vis the states. And so the bailout position was a backhanded way of strengthening the federal government vis-a-vis the states. It also was a way to establish America in international credit markets. And so that was Hamilton's idea. Again, we've moved away from it. But that was Hamilton's idea, and that's what we did in the first Congress. It was assuming our revolutionary ordinance. And again, we did it again too after 1812.
Great, and I know this isn't quite relevant because it's federal debt, but we're also seeing that long-term mounting federal debt doesn't really matter. MMT is really popular right now. Thomas Judson says he's 75, so it's not an issue for him, but he's wondering and worrying about his grandchildren, and can that somehow play into maybe state or city debts? So
if you're worried about federal debts, clearly the federal government spending more money by giving money to states and cities to pay their debts would increase the size of the federal debt. I'm not going to I don't have any particular expertise to bear on the question of when, under what circumstances does federal debt matter. But it is, if you are worried about that, then yes, spending more money makes federal debt more. Again, the federal government has tools that states and cities don't have. Again, the federal government isn't going to default. It can inflate away the money by printing money, or it can, it has extraordinary powers to tax. It's not like federal taxes are really at their, they could go much higher, and you don't have the worries about exit that you do with respect to state and local taxes. So in your next session where you have Stephanie Kelton or Paul Krugman come talk about, they can talk about federal debt in this respect. But I suspect one thing is that to the extent people are worried about it, you should expect to see cuts in federal spending going forward, which will exacerbate states, because states are very reliant on money coming from the federal discretionary budget. And so if the federal government cuts the money it spends on a whole variety of projects, that would make states' problems worse. And so any effort to pull back federal spending will have downstream effects on states. And that's true for a whole variety of budget cutting things. So one very popular proposal in periods when we are talking about cutting federal spending is to raise the Medicare, the age where you become eligible for Medicare. This would have very catastrophic effects on state debts because states are often required for paying these OPEB liabilities, the healthcare liabilities for public workers. And if they are required to pay the healthcare work for public workers and the Medicare age increases, then the states are on the hook for a lot more money. And so the federal government does very little to account for the effect of its increases or decreases of spending on state and local governments, and it should do a lot more, because often when we say cutting the federal debt, what we mean is increasing the burdens on states and cities.
Okay, great. I'm going to try and fold in some more questions here. Pensions are a big topic of a bunch of these questions, and so kind of combining some of them, are the pension funds currently funded at adequate levels? And if they're not, you know, some states might have to close schools and fire active teachers, or police. We're seeing a lot of different departments that might have to take cuts in order to pay pensions and health benefits of retirees. So I guess if you could comment on some more of the pension funds.
So pensions are more underfunded net coming into the crisis, but in February, than they were going into the Great Recession. The pension underfunding has become the place where states and cities park their debts. Why do they do this? They do this because they're not subject to their debt limits. There's no rules against them doing so. There doesn't seem to be any political price to pay for doing so, and so it is an easy place to avoid a thing to avoid spending money on. If in a world where there are many demands on the fisc. Pensions are that they're invested in the stock market. We often assume, as one way we kind of hide these debts is by assuming high levels of return. We invest in increasingly risky assets in a period where we don't know what's going to happen with the stock market. This can have further negative effects on pension finance. And so pensions are in very, very bad shape, but thinking about pensions as somehow a separate problem from the jurisdiction that created them is probably not the right way to think about them. They're just a way of borrowing. So underfunding your pension is just a way of borrowing, just like issuing a bond. Again, there are different legal ramifications, there are different structural things, but the underfunding is just a way of not paying for something you're getting right now. It's just borrowing. And it's not specific to whether the pensions are rich or poor. So if the pensions we're giving foreign workers a lot in compensation in their retirement or a little, we can underfund in either instance. And we have.
And we have one of our alums here, Lloyd Lim, has looked at GO bond offering statements, and the disclosure about the pension liability is less than robust, he says. So sort of a lip service without detail. And he says, don't you find this kind of annoying, or wonder why the bond rating agencies don't seem to care? And he gets that it doesn't facilitate commerce, but.
Yeah, yes, it's super annoying. State and municipal governments, state and local governments are exempt from some of the securities laws under something called the Tower Amendment. And so the requirements on what they're required to publish in advance of issuing debt is not robust. And I've suggested that we should reverse the Tower Amendment in order to put greater basically to kind of create greater pressure on states and localities to kind of account for their pension links by making them publish it in their bond issuances. Bond issuances are the reason that has been the case is that, again, there's just not very much state municipal default over the 20th century. You're talking about a 1% default rate for state municipal bonds, something a little north of there, but not too much. And so the Tower Amendment is premised on the idea that, well, we don't really need to protect investors from something that doesn't default anyway. Whether that continues to be true is something we will see, I suppose. But it is that's the underlying logic. But yes, I also find it annoying. I would like to have more public information on this.
Great, that was the end of our questions. I do want to thank you so much, Professor, and I wanted to pull Kate Benner back. and just see if she has any last closing thoughts. Otherwise, Professor, thank you so much. And if you have any closing thoughts, we'd love to hear them.
No, I just want to say thanks. I'll say goodbye to Kate too. That was really fun. Thank you all so much. And I'm glad we got so many people here talking about state and local finance. It's the new hotness. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. This can be appreciated. Just want to mention that Professor, this was massive work of encyclopedic knowledge. We're going to post this on our YouTube channel, and hopefully I've heard a lot of people have lost their power, so hopefully.
God.
Right. Okay. But thanks everyone. I appreciate it. Bye bye.